The first thing Joe noticed about the Vigneto Club after midnight was not the music. It was the silence underneath it. The bass shook the floor. Glasses clinked. Rich men laughed too loudly. Beautiful omegas smiled at alphas who could ruin lives with one phone call. But beneath all of that, there was always a second layer. A quiet, watchful pressure. The kind of silence that belonged to money, violence, and secrets. Joe had survived 3 years inside that silence by becoming part of the furniture. He was an omega bartender, but most nights people forgot that. He kept his scent locked beneath strong suppressants. He kept his eyes down unless he needed to observe. He remembered who drank too much, who lied badly, who touched their cuffs before making threats, and which alpha smiled right before ordering someone to disappear. Being invisible was not loneliness to Joe. It was survival. That night, the air changed before the doors opened. The alphas near the private booths straightened without meaning to. Conversations thinned. Even the omegas in expensive clothes went still, their bodies reacting before their minds understood why. Then Wayne Volkov walked in. Everyone in the city knew the name. Wayne Volkov, the Wolf. Alpha King of the Underground. A man who owned politicians without shaking their hands and made enemies vanish without raising his voice. He did not need to clear a path. The crowd moved for him. Joe kept polishing a glass that was already clean. He did not look directly at Wayne, not at first. Looking at a man like that was an invitation, and Joe had spent his whole life refusing invitations from dangerous alphas. Still, he felt Wayne before he saw him. The pheromone pressure rolled through the room like cold smoke, controlled but unmistakable. Not wild. Not messy. It was disciplined, powerful, and heavy enough to make several people lower their heads. Joe's body reacted, but not the way it should have. His pulse jumped, his fingers tightened around the glass, but he did not crumble. Years of suppressants had done damage, maybe protection too. His instincts were dulled where other omegas' instincts were sharp. He could breathe under alpha pressure better than most. That was why he made the mistake of looking up. Wayne's eyes met his across the bar. For 1 second, nothing moved. Joe looked away first. He told himself that was enough. He told himself Wayne would sit in his reserved booth with his men, drink something expensive, conduct business in low voices, and leave. That was how survival worked. Dangerous men passed through. Joe served them. Joe forgot them. But Wayne did not sit. He walked to the bar. The patrons near Joe suddenly remembered other places they needed to be. A man abandoned half a drink. A woman laughed too loudly and moved away. Within seconds, the bar felt too open, too exposed. Wayne stopped in front of him. "Vodka," he said. His voice was calm, low, and clean. "Neat." Joe nodded. Of course. He hated that his voice sounded steady, because inside, every old warning was screaming. He reached for the bottle, poured the drink with practiced precision, and placed it on the bar. Before Wayne touched it, Marco appeared. Marco was a junior manager at Vigneto, the kind of man who smiled at powerful people and snapped at staff when nobody important was looking. He slid onto the stool beside Wayne with a nervous brightness that instantly made Joe's skin prickle. "Mr. Volkov," Marco said, too eager. "An honor, as always. Let me make that special for you." Joe's hand paused. Marco reached over the bar without asking, took the glass Joe had just poured, and set it closer to Wayne. Then he pulled a small, unlabeled bottle from inside his jacket. It was quick. Too quick for most people to notice. But Joe noticed everything. Marco's fingers shook. His smile stretched too wide. His pupils were blown open, and his breathing was too shallow. He tipped one clear drop into the vodka. It vanished instantly. "A private blend," Marco said softly. "Only for you." Joe's stomach went cold. He knew that kind of performance. The false confidence. The prop. The way a coward acted brave because someone more frightening stood behind him. This was not a gift. This was an execution. Wayne looked at the glass. His expression did not change. He reached for it. Joe heard his own heartbeat more loudly than the music. For years he had obeyed one rule. Never get involved. Never step between wolves. Never let an alpha's war become his own. But he remembered another room. Another drink. Another man who should have been warned. He remembered what silence had cost before. His hand moved before his fear could stop it. On a cocktail napkin, Joe wrote quickly, "Don't drink it." He slid the napkin across the bar. It stopped beside Wayne's glass. Joe turned away immediately, pretending to rinse a glass in the sink. His whole body tightened, waiting for the shout, the gun, the hand around his throat. Anything. The silence behind him stretched. Then Wayne's hand closed around Joe's wrist. Joe froze. The grip was not painful, but it was absolute. Warm fingers held him against the bar like Wayne had all the time in the world to decide what Joe was worth. Joe slowly turned. Wayne was watching him now, not the drink, not Marco, not the room. Him. There was no surprise in Wayne's face. No panic. Only a sharp, unreadable focus that made Joe feel stripped of every mask he had ever worn. Why? Wayne asked quietly. Joe's mouth went dry. I don't know what you mean. Wayne's thumb pressed lightly against Joe's pulse. His eyes lowered to the place where Joe's scent gland was hidden beneath his collar, then returned to his face. You warned me, Wayne said. You noticed what everyone else missed. Marco's smile had collapsed. Mr. Volkov, I don't know what he wrote, but he's just staff. Omegas get nervous around strong alphas. He probably misunderstood. Wayne did not look at him. Leave, he said. Marco went pale. Sir, I only meant. One of Wayne's men stepped forward from the booth. That was all it took. Marco backed away, his face slick with panic, and disappeared into the crowd. Joe tried to pull his wrist free. Wayne let him struggle for half a second, then tightened his grip, just enough to remind him who controlled the space between them. You are not reacting correctly, Wayne murmured. Joe swallowed. What does that mean? My pheromones should have you shaking harder than this. I'm on suppressants. Strong ones. Joe said nothing. Wayne studied him like he had just found a hidden blade inside a silk glove. Joe hated the way his body responded. Fear, yes. But not only fear. There was heat beneath it, unwanted and humiliating, dragged out by the controlled force of Wayne's presence. Wayne leaned closer. You saw the poison. You knew the risk. You warned me anyway. His voice dropped lower. Who are you? Joe forced himself to answer. Joe. I work here. That is where you are, Wayne said. Not who you are. Joe's chest tightened. Wayne finally released his wrist, but the warmth of his fingers remained like a brand. He picked up the napkin, folded it once, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he stood. Joe took one step back. I told you what I saw. That's all. No, Wayne said. That is the beginning. Two of his men moved closer. The club around them kept pretending not to watch. Joe understood then. The moment he wrote those words, his invisible life had ended. Wayne looked at him with terrifying calm. Get your things. Joe's breath caught. My shift isn't over. It is now. He should have argued. He should have run. But Wayne's gaze held him in place, and deeper than fear, Joe knew the truth. If he ran, Wayne would find him. If he stayed, the people behind Marco would find him. Either way, the life he had protected so carefully was already gone. Minutes later, Joe stood in the alley behind Vignetto with his bag clutched in one hand and cold air burning his lungs. A black car waited with the engine running. Wayne opened the back door. Joe looked at him. Where are you taking me? Wayne's eyes moved once to Joe's wrist, where his pulse was still racing. Somewhere I can see you. Joe did not move. Wayne leaned slightly closer, his voice quiet enough that only Joe could hear. From now on, little Omega, you stay where I can see you. And when Joe stepped into the car, he felt the door close behind him like the sound of his old life being locked away. The ride through the city felt unreal, like Joe had stepped into somebody else's life without permission, because the silence inside Wayne Volkov's car was heavier than the noise outside. And every time Joe glanced toward the dark window beside him, he saw nothing except his own reflection staring back with tense shoulders and frightened eyes. Wayne sat across from him in the dim interior light, one arm resting against the leather seat, his expression unreadable as he typed short messages on his phone, while the two men in front remained completely silent, their attention constantly shifting between mirrors, streets, and passing vehicles as if danger could appear from any direction at any moment. Joe understood then that this was not paranoia. Men like Wayne survived because they expected betrayal everywhere. You drug your suppressants regularly, Wayne said suddenly without looking up from his phone, and Joe's stomach tightened because it was not phrased like a question. Joe forced his voice steady. That's normal for Omegas. Not to that degree. Joe stayed quiet. Wayne finally lifted his gaze, pale eyes settling on him with unsettling precision. Your scent is faint even at this distance. Most suppressants weaken after midnight, especially in crowded places full of dominant alphas, but yours barely shifted at all inside the club. Joe looked away toward the window. I don't like attention. That is not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. For a second Joe thought Wayne might get angry, but instead something strange flickered across the alpha's face, not irritation, but interest, and somehow that was worse. Wayne studied him the same way Joe studied people at the club, like he was pulling apart tiny details and building a picture from them piece by piece. Joe hated that feeling. He hated being observed by somebody smart enough to understand what he was seeing. The car eventually descended into a private underground garage beneath one of the tallest buildings in the city, and Joe's pulse grew heavier with each passing second because this no longer felt like temporary protection. It felt permanent. The elevator ride to the penthouse passed in silence except for the soft mechanical hum beneath their feet, and when the doors finally opened, Joe stopped walking for half a second without meaning to. The penthouse was enormous, cold, and painfully elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline like Wayne owned every light below. Dark furniture, polished stone, low warm lighting, and absolute silence filled the space. It did not feel like a home. It felt like control turned into architecture. Wayne removed his jacket slowly and draped it across a chair before walking toward the bar near the windows. "You'll stay here for now." Joe crossed his arms instinctively. "You mean until you decide whether I'm useful or dangerous?" Wayne poured himself a drink without reacting. "You are already both." Joe hated how calmly he said things like that. One of Wayne's men approached quietly from behind. He was older than the others, broad-shouldered with tired eyes and a scar near his jaw that looked old enough to have become part of his face. "Perimeter secure," he said. Wayne nodded once. "Franco, this is Joe." "Joe, Franco." Franco looked at Joe for a brief moment, not cruelly, but carefully, like he was trying to understand why an Omega bartender was suddenly inside the Wolf King's penthouse. "Boss wants you safe," he said simply. Joe almost laughed at that. Safe was not the word he would have chosen. Wayne turned back toward him. "Your apartment was searched 30 minutes ago." Joe froze. "What?" One of Marco's contacts panicked after the poisoning failed. "Your building cameras caught 2 men entering through the back stairwell. They spent 12 minutes inside your apartment." Cold spread through Joe's chest. His apartment had never been much. Small kitchen, old couch, thin walls, barely enough space to breathe sometimes, but it had been his. It had been the only place where nobody watched him constantly. "They found nothing," Wayne continued, "because you came with me." Joe swallowed hard. "And if I refused?" Wayne took a slow sip of whiskey. "Then you would likely be dead by morning." The terrifying part was that Joe believed him completely. Franco left quietly after that, leaving them alone in the enormous penthouse, and the silence between Joe and Wayne became strangely intimate, heavy with unspoken things. Joe stayed near the entrance like he was afraid stepping deeper inside would mean accepting this new reality permanently. "You can stop looking for exits," Wayne said. Joe stiffened. "I'm not." "You checked the elevator twice, the hallway once, and the balcony doors the second you entered." Wayne's eyes lifted toward him. "You notice everything." Joe looked away first. "Observant people survive longer." "And frightened people?" Joe answered before thinking. "They survive longest." Something about that made Wayne go quiet for a moment. Eventually Wayne walked toward a hallway and opened one of the doors. "Guest room. Bathroom inside. Clothes will be brought up shortly." Joe frowned. "You already planned that?" "I plan everything." That answer should not have affected him the way it did, but Joe suddenly imagined how exhausting it must be to live inside Wayne's head, constantly calculating danger, betrayal, movement, weakness. No wonder the man barely blinked. Joe stepped inside the room cautiously. It looked like a luxury hotel suite, too clean, too perfect, too impersonal. His worn bag looked pathetic sitting against expensive furniture. Wayne remained standing in the doorway, watching him quietly. "You keep staring at my scent gland," Joe said before he could stop himself. Wayne did not deny it. "You're resistant," Wayne said calmly. "Not immune, but resistant. That is extremely unusual for an Omega." Joe crossed his arms tighter. "You sound disappointed." "No," Wayne's voice lowered slightly. "I sound curious." That word settled strangely beneath Joe's skin. Wayne finally stepped back. "Sleep if you can." Joe almost asked whether Wayne ever slept at all, but the alpha disappeared down the hallway before he could speak. Hours later Joe still could not rest. The bed was too soft, the room too quiet, and every time he closed his eyes, he remembered Wayne's hand around his wrist at the club. The terrifying part was not the strength. It was the restraint. Wayne could have overpowered him effortlessly, but he had chosen not to, and Joe did not know what to do with an alpha who held back on purpose. Sometime after 3 in the morning, Joe finally gave up trying to sleep and wandered quietly toward the kitchen, expecting darkness. Instead, he found Wayne standing near the counter in rolled sleeves, reading something on a tablet while a cup of untouched tea cooled beside him. Wayne looked up immediately. "You should be asleep." Joe leaned against the doorway. "You should too." For the first time, Wayne's mouth twitched slightly like he almost smiled. "I rarely sleep well." Joe noticed 3 empty coffee cups nearby, and before thinking, he walked farther into the kitchen, picked up the kettle, and reheated the water. Wayne watched him the entire time without speaking. "You drink tea when you're stressed," Joe said quietly. Wayne raised an eyebrow. "And how did you decide that?" "You haven't touched the whiskey tonight." Silence lingered for a second before Wayne slowly set the tablet aside. "You really do see everything." Joe poured fresh tea into Wayne's cup and slid it toward him. "Comes with the job." Wayne accepted the cup, but their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange, and Joe instantly felt the difference between casual contact and alpha contact. Heat moved up his arm too quickly, subtle but dangerous, and Wayne clearly noticed because his eyes darkened slightly. Joe stepped back immediately. Wayne's gaze stayed on him for a long moment before shifting away. "You should continue using your suppressants while you're here." Joe frowned. "Why does that sound like an order?" "Because there are other alphas connected to my organization." Wayne's voice hardened slightly. "Some are disciplined. Some are not. I don't intend to let anyone react to your scent." Joe blinked slowly. "You talk like I belong to your territory already." Wayne leaned back against the counter, looking impossibly calm. "You entered my car willingly. I didn't exactly have choices." "No," Wayne agreed quietly. "You didn't." The honesty of it unsettled Joe more than manipulation would have. Then suddenly Wayne's phone buzzed. He checked the screen once, and the atmosphere in the kitchen shifted immediately. Joe saw it happen in real time. Wayne's shoulders stiffened. His jaw tightened. The alpha scent in the air thickened slightly, sharper now. "What happened?" Joe asked carefully. Wayne typed a response with one hand. "Marco was found dead." Joe felt cold all over. Wayne looked up slowly, his eyes unreadable again. "Which means the people behind tonight's poisoning are cleaning loose ends already." Joe's heartbeat quickened. "And now I'm one too." Wayne stared at him across the quiet kitchen while the city lights glowed behind him like distant fire. "Yes," Wayne said softly. "Which is exactly why you're staying where I can see you." The days after Marco's death settled into a strange rhythm that Joe never fully trusted, because living inside Wayne Volkov's penthouse felt less like captivity now and more like existing inside the center of a storm where everything dangerous eventually passed through. Men in expensive suits arrived at all hours carrying tablets, weapons, whispered reports, and exhausted expressions, while Wayne moved through all of it with cold precision, listening more than speaking and noticing details most people missed. Joe recognized that habit immediately because it mirrored his own, and somehow that similarity unsettled him more than Wayne's power ever had. Joe started helping almost by accident. At first it was small things. A false invoice left open on somebody's tablet. A nervous pause in a lieutenant's speech. An alpha named Victor who claimed he had been at the docks all night, but still smelled faintly of expensive cigar smoke from a club across town. Joe noticed the inconsistencies automatically because years behind the bar had trained him to survive by reading people faster than they could lie. Wayne noticed Joe noticing. That became dangerous very quickly. One afternoon Joe sat at the long dining table translating a stack of financial documents Wayne's organization had intercepted from a shell company tied to Marco's payments when Wayne suddenly stopped beside him and placed another file in front of him without explanation. Joe frowned. "What's this?" "Shipping manifests from the northern ports." "You think they're fake?" "I think you'll tell me whether they are." Joe hated how naturally Wayne included him now, like his presence inside the penthouse had become permanent without either of them discussing it. Still, he opened the folder and started reading. 10 minutes later he found it. "This line," Joe said quietly. "The wording changes here." Wayne stepped closer. "Explain." "The first half was written by someone fluent in English. The second wasn't." Joe pointed lower on the page. "The grammar is technically correct, but the phrasing is awkward. Somebody copied previous manifests without understanding the natural sentence structure." Wayne leaned over the table beside him, close enough that Joe caught the faint scent of cedar and whiskey beneath the alpha's suppressants. "Meaning?" "Different authors." Joe looked up. "Somebody inserted fake shipping data afterward." Wayne stayed silent for a second before taking the folder back. You found that faster than my accountants. Joe shrugged lightly. Your accountants probably aren't paranoid. Wayne's eyes lingered on him too long again. No, he said quietly. They aren't. The more Joe helped, the more people inside Wayne's organization started noticing him, and not all of them liked it. Franco tolerated Joe because Wayne trusted him. Others were less subtle. Joe caught whispers stopping whenever he entered rooms, suspicious looks from alphas who disliked seeing an Omega sitting beside Wayne during meetings, and once he overheard somebody mutter that Wayne was becoming distracted. The worst was Amex Serrano. Joe met him 3 days after Marco's death during a strategy meeting inside Wayne's private office. Amex arrived late, calm and polished in a dark suit, carrying himself with the confidence of somebody used to standing near power. He was handsome in a sharp, dangerous way, but Joe disliked him immediately because Amex smiled too perfectly while his eyes stayed cold. An Omega at the table now? Amex asked casually after Wayne introduced Joe. That's new. Wayne didn't even glance up from the documents in front of him. Joe stays. Amex's smile tightened almost invisibly. Joe noticed. That was the problem. He noticed everything. As the meeting continued, Joe kept catching Amex watching him, not with attraction, but irritation, like Joe represented something inconvenient. Wayne trusted Amex deeply. That much was obvious. He gave the man access to sensitive information, private routes, internal finances. But underneath Amex's calm voice, Joe sensed resentment simmering quietly beneath the surface. Later that night, Joe stood alone near the penthouse windows staring at the city lights when Wayne approached from behind carrying 2 glasses of water. You dislike Amex, Wayne said. Joe accepted the glass carefully. He dislikes me first. Wayne stood beside him, shoulder almost brushing Joe's. Amex dislikes change. No, Joe replied softly. He dislikes losing importance. Wayne turned slightly toward him then, attention sharpening. That's an interesting distinction. Joe hesitated before speaking again. He looks at you like he's waiting for you to become who you used to be. Silence settled between them. After a moment, Wayne asked quietly, And who do you think I used to be? Joe looked out over the city instead of answering immediately. Probably somebody colder. Wayne laughed once under his breath, low and humorless. You think I'm less dangerous now? I think you're tired. That made Wayne go still. Joe regretted the words instantly because nobody should speak to Wayne Volkov that honestly, but instead of anger, Wayne only studied him with that same unreadable intensity that always made Joe's chest tighten. You see too much, Wayne murmured. Joe forced himself to look away first. Occupational hazard. Things became worse after the warehouse incident. One of Wayne's shipments was ambushed near the docks just after midnight, and by the time Wayne returned to the penthouse hours later, the entire atmosphere around him felt wrong. Joe sensed it before the elevator doors even opened. Alpha pheromones flooded the hallway, sharp and violent, thick enough to make Joe's instincts recoil painfully beneath his suppressants. Franco stepped out first, looking tense. Nobody goes near him tonight. Joe frowned immediately. What happened? 3 men dead, Franco answered quietly. Boss almost got hit. Then Wayne walked inside. Joe's breath caught. Wayne's control was slipping. Not completely, but enough that the air around him felt dangerous. His shirt sleeves were rolled carelessly. There was blood across one cuff that clearly did not belong to him, and his pheromones pulsed heavily through the penthouse with restless aggression. Every alpha nearby instinctively backed away. Joe didn't. Wayne reached the kitchen counter and braced one hand against it hard enough to crack the silence between them. For the first time since meeting him, Joe saw genuine exhaustion beneath Wayne's composure. Everybody out, Wayne said coldly. The room emptied immediately except for Joe. Franco hesitated. Joe! It's fine, Joe interrupted quietly. Wayne's eyes snapped toward him instantly, darker now, more dangerous. You should leave too. Joe's pulse jumped hard, but he stayed where he was. You're losing control. Wayne laughed once without humor. Observant as always. The pheromone pressure thickened suddenly, making Joe grip the edge of the counter to steady himself. Even muted by suppressants, Wayne's alpha scent hit like heat rolling through his bloodstream. Joe, Wayne warned softly. Go. But Joe saw something nobody else seemed willing to acknowledge. Wayne was fighting himself harder than anybody in the room feared him. Slowly, carefully, Joe stepped closer. Franco looked horrified. Wayne's entire body tensed immediately. Do not come closer. Joe ignored him. The second Joe reached out and grabbed Wayne's wrist, the entire room went still. Wayne froze. The violent pheromone pressure that had filled the penthouse moments earlier suddenly eased, not disappearing completely, but settling enough that everyone present noticed the difference immediately. Franco stared openly now. Wayne looked down at Joe's hand around his wrist like he could not quite believe it himself. Joe realized too late what he had done. The connection between them felt unbearably intimate. Wayne's pulse hammered beneath Joe's fingers, strong and fast, and instead of fear, Joe felt heat bloom low in his stomach in response to the alpha standing inches away from him. Wayne's voice dropped lower. "You should not touch me right now." Joe swallowed hard but didn't move away. "Then stop looking at me like you want me to." For one dangerous second neither of them breathed. Then Wayne suddenly stepped backward, pulling his wrist free with visible effort before turning away sharply. "Everybody out," he repeated roughly. This time Joe obeyed. But later that night, long after the penthouse had gone quiet, Joe woke suddenly with heat crawling beneath his skin and his suppressants failing far earlier than they should have. And somewhere down the hallway, behind a locked door, Wayne Volkov was awake too. Joe knew the heat was coming long before his body fully surrendered to it, because years of suppressants had taught him how to recognize the warning signs early. The rising temperature beneath his skin, the growing sensitivity to scent, the restless ache curling low in his stomach that no amount of cold water or deep breathing could erase. But this time felt different, heavier somehow, because Wayne's pheromones still lingered everywhere inside the penthouse after the warehouse incident, woven into the furniture, the hallways, the air itself, and Joe's body reacted to it in ways he could no longer fully suppress. The next morning Wayne did not appear at breakfast. Franco quietly informed Joe that Wayne had locked himself inside the private office downstairs and ordered every alpha except Franco to stay away from the penthouse until further notice. That alone told Joe how serious the situation had become, because powerful alphas rarely isolated themselves unless rut instincts were beginning to override control. Joe tried pretending none of it affected him. He spent hours translating files in the library, reviewing financial ledgers connected to Amex's recent movements, and forcing himself to focus on numbers instead of the constant awareness sitting heavily in his chest. But by evening his suppressants were failing completely. Every sound felt sharper. Every scent too strong. His skin burned beneath his clothes. And underneath everything else he could smell Wayne. Not aggressively. Not intentionally. Just enough to make Joe's pulse race every time he breathed. Franco noticed first. "You should stay in your room tonight," he said carefully while standing near the kitchen island, clearly trying not to inhale too deeply around Joe. "Boss already locked the lower level." Joe stared at the glass of water in his hands. "How bad is it?" Franco hesitated. "Wayne's still in control." Then after a pause he added quietly, "But barely." That answer should have frightened Joe more than it did. Instead, something warmer twisted painfully beneath his ribs. Because Wayne had every opportunity to overpower him by now. The penthouse belonged to him. The guards obeyed him without question. Joe was isolated, vulnerable, trapped inside an alpha's territory while entering heat. Any other alpha in Wayne's position would have already crossed every line possible. Wayne kept choosing not to. That mattered more than Joe wanted it to. Later that night Joe stood alone outside Wayne's office door with his heart pounding hard enough to make him angry at himself. Heat made people reckless. That was biology. That was instinct. Joe had spent years learning how to survive despite those instincts. But Wayne's restraint was breaking down every defense Joe had built around himself, because kindness from powerful people was far more dangerous than cruelty. The scent hit him the second he opened the door. Alpha pheromones flooded the dark office, thick and overwhelming, rich with stress, exhaustion, and restrained hunger. Joe nearly stumbled backward from the force of it, but he steadied himself against the doorframe and forced his breathing to slow. Wayne sat near the windows with his sleeves rolled up and his head tipped back against the chair, eyes closed tightly like he was physically fighting his own body. The moment Joe stepped inside, Wayne's eyes opened instantly. For one terrible second neither of them spoke. Then Wayne stood too quickly. "Joe!" His voice sounded rougher than usual. Joe swallowed hard. "Franco said you locked yourself down here. Because you're in heat." Joe tried to ignore the way Wayne's gaze kept dropping toward the scent gland beneath his collar. "You're acting like I'm dangerous." "You are." The honesty in Wayne's voice sent heat rushing painfully through Joe's body. Wayne turned away sharply, one hand braced against the desk. "You shouldn't be here." And you shouldn't be alone right now. Wayne laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor in it. You have no idea what you're doing to me. Joe stared at his back silently for a moment before answering softly. Then explain it. That made Wayne go still. Slowly he turned around again, and Joe's breath caught because Wayne looked less like the controlled alpha king everyone feared and more like a man holding himself together through sheer force alone. His shirt collar was open, his hair slightly disheveled, his jaw tense enough to hurt. You want honesty? Wayne asked quietly. Fine. Every instinct I have right now is telling me to drag you closer. Sent you until every alpha in the city knows you belong to me, and lock every door between you and the rest of the world. His eyes darkened further. And I hate myself for wanting that. Joe's pulse stumbled hard. Wayne stepped closer slowly, carefully, like approaching something capable of destroying him too. I spent years believing attachment was weakness. Then you walked into my club, looked me directly in the eyes, and risked your life for mine. His voice lowered further. Now I can't go a single day without wondering where you are in this penthouse. Joe's chest tightened painfully. Heat blurred everything, but not enough to hide the truth sitting between them anymore. You scare me, Joe admitted quietly. Wayne nodded once. I know, but not because I think you'll hurt me. That finally cracked something in Wayne's expression. Joe stepped closer before he could lose his nerve. You scare me because you make me want things I stopped believing in a long time ago. Wayne stared at him silently, like every carefully controlled part of himself was unraveling piece by piece. Then Joe reached up and touched his face. Wayne inhaled sharply. The contact felt devastatingly intimate. Warm skin beneath Joe's fingers. The faint tremor Wayne tried to hide. The terrifying realization that this man trusted almost nobody, and yet kept lowering his guard around him anyway. Joe, Wayne said quietly, almost like a warning. Joe kissed him before he could stop himself. For half a heartbeat Wayne froze completely. Then Wayne kissed him back. It was not rough or possessive the way Joe expected from someone like him. It was restrained at first, almost careful, like Wayne still feared crossing a line Joe would regret later. But beneath that restraint Joe felt everything Wayne had been holding back for weeks, the obsession, the exhaustion, the hunger, the terrifying relief of finally touching him. Joe's hands tightened against Wayne's shirt as Wayne pulled him closer slowly, one hand settling against Joe's waist with visible control. The kiss deepened. Joe could barely breathe through the heat flooding his body now, but he did not want Wayne to stop. For the first time in years, he did not feel trapped inside his Omega instincts. He felt chosen. Wayne eventually broke the kiss first, breathing unevenly against Joe's forehead. You don't understand what you're agreeing to, he murmured. Joe's heart pounded painfully. Then explain that too. Wayne closed his eyes briefly before resting his forehead against Joe's. If I lose control during rut, I could mark you permanently. Joe's breath caught. Wayne's hand tightened slightly at his waist before immediately loosening again. Another tiny act of restraint that somehow hurt more than aggression would have. I refuse to make you mine because of biology, Wayne whispered roughly. If you ever belong beside me, it has to be your choice. Joe stared at him silently while his entire body burned from heat and emotion and want. Then slowly, carefully, Joe leaned forward until his lips brushed Wayne's again. I kissed you before the heat got bad, Joe whispered against his mouth. Remember that. Something dangerously soft appeared in Wayne's eyes then, something far more frightening than dominance ever could have been. And downstairs, far beyond the locked office doors, MX Serrano quietly watched the security feed turn black after Wayne manually disconnected the cameras himself. After the night inside Wayne's office, something fundamental shifted between them, not loudly or dramatically, but in the quiet details that suddenly became impossible to ignore. Joe no longer slept alone every night because sometimes exhaustion dragged him toward Wayne's room without either of them acknowledging it aloud, and Wayne stopped pretending he did not search for Joe first whenever he entered a room. The tension between them remained dangerous, heavy with restraint and unfinished instinct. But now it carried something softer too, something that made Joe's chest tighten whenever Wayne absent-mindedly adjusted the scent bracelet around his wrist or silently placed tea beside him during late nights in the library. That softness became exactly what destroyed everything. Wayne's enemies noticed the change. Amex noticed first. Joe caught him watching them constantly now during meetings, especially whenever Wayne allowed Joe to remain beside him while discussing business that no outsider should hear. The resentment inside Amex had stopped hiding itself. Joe saw it in every tight smile and every fraction of hesitation before Amex obeyed Wayne's orders. Silas Hawk saw it too. That terrified Joe more. Because unlike Amex's bitterness, Hawk's interest felt calculated, patient, almost amused. Every move Hawk made after the failed assassination attempt seemed designed less to kill Wayne directly and more to destabilize him emotionally. And Joe slowly realized the horrifying truth. Hawk had figured out that Wayne's weakness was no longer his empire. It was Joe. The attack happened 3 nights later. Wayne had reluctantly agreed to let Joe accompany Franco to a secure meeting location across the city because Joe had identified inconsistencies inside financial records connected to Amex's private accounts, and Wayne needed confirmation before moving openly against one of his oldest allies. Joe remembered Wayne standing beside the elevator beforehand, adjusting the collar of Joe's coat with controlled irritation. "You stay beside Franco the entire time," Wayne ordered quietly. Joe rolled his eyes lightly. "I'm going to a meeting, not a battlefield." Wayne's expression remained cold, but his hand lingered near Joe's scent gland for half a second too long. Those are often the same thing. Joe almost smiled at that. It was the last normal moment he had. The convoy never reached the meeting site. The attack came fast and brutally organized, black SUVs cutting off the road while gunfire exploded through the underground tunnel around them. Franco reacted instantly, shoving Joe down behind the armored vehicle door while Wayne's guards returned fire. "Stay down," Franco barked. Joe's heart slammed violently against his ribs as bullets ricocheted off concrete walls nearby. But even through the chaos, he noticed something wrong immediately. The attackers were not trying to kill him. They were targeting the guards first. "They want me alive," Joe realized aloud. Franco's face darkened instantly. "Damn it!" Gas flooded the tunnel seconds later. Joe barely had time to inhale once before dizziness crashed into him violently. His suppressants reacted badly with whatever chemical the attackers used, and within moments his body temperature spiked painfully as the world tilted sideways. The last thing Joe saw before losing consciousness was Franco shooting 2 approaching men while screaming Wayne's name into the comms. When Joe woke up again, his wrists were restrained. The room smelled wrong immediately. Strong alpha pheromones saturated the air deliberately, aggressively, enough to disorient any omega trapped inside for too long. Joe forced himself upright despite the nausea clawing through his body and focused on surviving instead of panicking. A slow clap echoed from somewhere nearby. "Well," Silas Hawk said smoothly while stepping from the shadows, "the famous Omega finally wakes up." Joe stared at him carefully. Hawk looked ordinary at first glance, which somehow made him more unsettling. Calm posture. Precise voice. Intelligent eyes that missed nothing. A man who weaponized patience instead of brute force. "You're not here to kill me," Joe said quietly. Hawk smiled slightly. "Not immediately." Joe forced himself to stay calm despite the pheromones suffocating the room. "Wayne's already hunting you." "Of course he is." Hawk leaned casually against the table nearby. "That's the point." Joe finally understood then. This kidnapping was not strategy. It was psychological warfare. Hawk wanted Wayne angry enough to stop thinking clearly. "You're fascinated by him," Joe realized suddenly. Hawk's smile widened faintly. "No. I'm fascinated by what you've done to him." He tilted his head slightly. Wayne Volkov spent years becoming untouchable. Then one Omega bartender looked him in the eyes, and suddenly the Wolf King started hesitating before violence. Hawk's gaze sharpened. "That makes you dangerous." Joe stayed silent. Hawk crouched slightly until they were eye level. "Do you know what Amex said about you?" His voice softened mockingly. "He said Wayne stopped acting like a king the moment he started acting like your alpha." Joe's stomach tightened. Amex really had betrayed Wayne completely. The door opened behind Hawk moments later, and Amex himself stepped inside, looking exhausted and furious all at once. The second his eyes landed on Joe, resentment twisted visibly across his face. "This is your fault," Amex snapped. "Everything was stable before you." Joe stared at him quietly. "You betrayed him long before I arrived." Amex's jaw tightened hard enough to hurt. Hawk watched both of them carefully, amused. "See? That's what I mean. Joe notices everything." Over the next several hours, Joe endured endless pressure from the alpha pheromones flooding the room, but he refused to break. Worse for Amex, Joe kept observing. He noticed which guards feared Hawk more than Amex. Which men exchanged uncertain looks whenever Amex gave orders. Which exits were used most often. Which security doors locked slower than the others. Joe started planting doubt carefully. You know Hawk will sacrifice you eventually, right? Joe said quietly during one argument between Amex and several guards. Amex glared at him. Shut up. Joe ignored him. You really think a man like Hawk shares power? The silence afterward told Joe everything he needed. Fear was already spreading inside their alliance. Then the building alarms suddenly exploded. Every guard in the room froze instantly. Gunfire echoed somewhere downstairs. Amex went pale. Hawk only sighed quietly. Ah, he murmured. There's the wolf. Joe's pulse stumbled violently. The next few minutes became chaos. Explosions shook the building. Men screamed. More alarms blared through the corridors while Wayne's organization tore through the compound room by room. Amex started shouting orders frantically, but nobody listened properly anymore because fear had already infected the room. Joe used the distraction immediately. He slammed a chair into the guard beside him, grabbed the dropped keycard from the floor, and unlocked one wrist just as the door burst open violently. Wayne entered like death itself. Joe had seen Wayne dangerous before. This was different. Blood stained Wayne's shirt sleeve again, but now there was nothing restrained left inside his eyes. Alpha pheromones flooded the room with terrifying force, crushing everyone present beneath pure murderous rage. Amex stumbled backward immediately. Hawk smiled faintly before slipping toward the emergency exit. Wayne barely looked at him. His entire focus locked onto Joe. For one horrifying second, Wayne simply stared at the bruises on Joe's wrists, the restraints, the scent of foreign alphas covering him, and Joe watched something inside Wayne fracture completely. Then Wayne crossed the room in seconds and pulled Joe against him so hard it almost hurt. Joe's body reacted instantly to the familiar scent wrapping around him again. Wayne buried his face briefly against Joe's neck like he needed proof Joe was alive. You're hurt, Wayne said roughly. I'm fine. That's a lie. Joe's hands grabbed Wayne's shirt tightly before he could stop himself. You came. Wayne pulled back just enough to look at him, and for the first time since meeting him, Joe saw genuine fear inside Wayne Volkov's eyes. Not fear for himself. Fear of losing him. Wayne's voice dropped lower, rough with emotion and fury. I would burn this entire city down before letting them keep you. Joe's chest tightened painfully. All this time Joe feared becoming trapped beside Wayne, feared losing himself inside an alpha powerful enough to consume everything around him. But Wayne was already ruined too. Slowly Joe reached up and touched Wayne's face despite the blood and chaos around them. Then quietly, with complete certainty, Joe whispered, If I'm going to belong anywhere, let it be with you. Wayne's control shattered. The alpha growled low in his throat before pulling Joe impossibly closer, and moments later Joe felt Wayne's teeth sink carefully into the scent gland beneath his neck while the bond between them locked permanently into place. The war did not end in one dramatic night the way movies liked to pretend it did, because men like Amex Serrano and Silas Hawk had built networks designed to survive collapse. And even after Wayne rescued Joe from the compound and marked him permanently, blood still continued spilling quietly across the city for weeks afterward. Safe houses were raided. Corrupt officials disappeared from public life overnight. Financial accounts connected to Amex's faction froze one by one while Wayne's organization systematically dismantled every remaining alliance that had supported the betrayal from inside. Hawk himself vanished before Wayne could reach him, leaving behind burned identities, empty properties, and terrified intermediaries who swore they had never truly known the man at all. In another life, Joe might have feared what Wayne was capable of during that period. But after seeing the devastation inside Wayne's eyes the moment he thought Joe might die, fear no longer came as easily as it once had. The mark at Joe's neck healed slowly. Some mornings it ached faintly beneath his collar. Other days it pulsed warmly whenever Wayne stepped close, the bond between them settling deeper into instinct and emotion alike. Joe had spent years suppressing every part of himself connected to Omega biology because vulnerability once felt dangerous, but now for the first time in his life, his own scent no longer felt like something shameful or unsafe. Wayne noticed everything changing. He noticed Joe slept longer now instead of waking instantly at every unfamiliar sound. He noticed Joe stopped checking exits first whenever entering a room. He noticed Joe laughed quietly sometimes during late-night conversations in the library without immediately looking guilty afterward. Those small things affected Wayne more than any battlefield victory ever had. One evening nearly a month after Amex's downfall, Joe walked barefoot into the kitchen sometime after midnight expecting to find the penthouse dark, only to discover Wayne sitting alone near the windows with paperwork spread across the table beside him. The city lights reflected softly across the glass while Wayne loosened the knot of his tie without realizing Joe had entered. "You're still awake," Joe murmured. Wayne looked up immediately, the tension in his face easing the second he saw him. "I could say the same thing." Joe moved closer slowly until Wayne reached out automatically and pulled him between his knees without interrupting the document in his hand. The movement happened so naturally now that neither of them questioned it anymore. Months ago that realization would have terrified Joe. Now it only made warmth settle quietly inside his chest. "You smell tired," Joe said softly. Wayne exhaled once through his nose, almost amused. "That sounds ridiculous." "It's true." Wayne finally set the papers aside before resting his forehead briefly against Joe's stomach, and the simple intimacy of it nearly shattered Joe all over again because this man still terrified entire cities while somehow becoming gentler only with him. "No meetings tomorrow," Wayne muttered quietly. Joe blinked. "You canceled your schedule? You haven't slept properly in 3 nights because you keep pretending your shoulder doesn't still hurt." Joe stared down at him in surprise. "You noticed that?" Wayne looked up slowly. "Joe," he said softly, "I notice everything about you." That should not have affected him as much as it did. Joe leaned down carefully and kissed Wayne once, slow and familiar, before Wayne's hand slid instinctively toward the mark at Joe's neck. The possessiveness remained, but it no longer felt suffocating the way Joe once feared it would. Wayne still touched the mark often, especially after stressful meetings or dangerous calls, but now Joe understood the truth beneath those gestures. Wayne was reassuring himself Joe remained beside him willingly. The difference mattered. Life inside the penthouse slowly stopped feeling like imprisonment somewhere along the way. Joe still helped Wayne with organization matters because his ability to read people and patterns remained too valuable to ignore. But now Wayne openly included him instead of keeping him hidden behind closed doors. Joe attended meetings, reviewed contracts, translated negotiations, and occasionally corrected powerful men who underestimated him badly enough to become embarrassing. Most of them stopped making that mistake quickly, especially after witnessing the way Wayne reacted whenever somebody disrespected Joe publicly. The city changed too. Rumors spread constantly throughout the underground about the Omega beside Wayne Volkov. Some called Joe manipulative. Others called him dangerous. A few claimed Joe controlled Wayne entirely, which always made Franco laugh harder than he should. "He was impossible before you," Franco admitted once while helping Joe review security reports. "Now he actually sleeps occasionally." Joe smiled faintly. "That's your definition of improvement?" "It's the closest thing we'll get." Even so, not everything healed perfectly. There were nights Joe still woke abruptly from old memories, body tense from dreams he never fully explained, and Wayne always noticed immediately no matter how quietly Joe tried leaving the bed afterward. Wayne never pushed him to talk during those moments. He simply followed him into the kitchen or library, stood nearby without demanding anything, and waited until Joe eventually leaned against him willingly. That patience changed Joe more than the mark ever could, because Wayne never once tried forcing Joe to become smaller for his comfort. Wayne protected him fiercely, yes, but he also listened when Joe challenged him, trusted Joe's instincts during negotiations, and slowly stopped treating control like the only way to keep people safe. Joe realized one night while watching Wayne negotiate with several political investors that the man beside him had changed too. Wayne still ruled the city through fear when necessary. Men still lowered their eyes around him. Enemies still vanished quietly. But somewhere between the poisoning at Vigneto and the bond now resting beneath Joe's skin, Wayne Volkov stopped building an empire solely around survival. Now he built one with something dangerously close to hope. The final gala happened almost 2 months after Amex's death inside one of the city's largest museums, filled with politicians, investors, powerful alphas, and enough security to start a small war. Joe stood beside Wayne near the center balcony, wearing a dark tailored suit, while cameras flashed constantly around them. Months ago, Joe would have hidden from that attention. Now he simply stood beside Wayne without fear. Halfway through the evening, Joe noticed an alpha investor across the room, staring too openly at the mark near his collar. The attention lingered long enough to become disrespectful. Wayne noticed immediately. Without breaking conversation, Wayne reached out calmly, pulled Joe closer against his side, and lowered his head until his lips brushed slowly against the mark on Joe's neck in full view of the crowded ballroom. The entire room went silent for half a heartbeat. Not because of aggression. Not because of dominance. Because everybody present understood exactly what Wayne Volkov had just declared without saying a single word. Joe looked up at him quietly afterward while Wayne's hand rested steady against his waist. "You enjoy terrifying people," Joe murmured. Wayne's eyes softened slightly in the way only Joe ever saw. "Only when they forget what's mine." Months ago those words would have made Joe run. Now Joe only smiled faintly before leaning closer. Far below them the city continued moving endlessly beneath the museum lights, still dangerous, still cruel, still filled with men capable of violence and betrayal. But for the first time in years, Joe no longer felt invisible inside it. Because the city feared Wayne Volkov. But Joe was the only person who ever truly saw the man beneath the wolf. And so, the Wolf King finally found the one person who never feared the monster inside him, while Joe discovered that love did not have to mean losing himself. Thank you for staying with Wayne and Joe until the very end, and we'll see you again in the next dark and unforgettable story.